Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues around the globe, welcome back to the Belvedere in Vienna, to our final or concluding session of this week's conference. Thanks for staying with us all the week and now to the bitter end this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce the panelists of tonight. Basically, we agreed that I don't really introduce, I just name them briefly, because the plan for tonight is that they introduce themselves very briefly by focusing on major aspects of their work or projects that they think are very important to what we discussed during the week. And after that, we will have a discussion among ourselves, but you can always post your questions into the chat, and finally we will open up to address them. So our panel consists tonight of Suze Anderson from George Washington University in Washington, DC. We have Carolyn Royston from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, and Jeffrey Schnapp from the Matter Lab at Harvard in Cambridge. So I don't really know who we agreed to let go first, but I think I remember Carolyn was first last time we saw each other.
Good evening, everybody. Hello from New York City. My name is Carolyn Royston, and I am the Chief Experience Officer at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. I am just going to share my screen for a few minutes, just to give you a little bit of a background to my current role and some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last year or so. So if you can just bear with me while I try to find my presentation. Sorry. So there we are. Okay, got there. So very briefly, this is who I am. This is the Cooper Hewitt, which is a mansion house on Fifth Avenue in New York, in an area called Miracle Mile. So it's about 2 blocks away from the Guggenheim Museum, 3 blocks away from the Met Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a block away from the Jewish Museum, and several other galleries. And so it's a big tourist area. And this is Andrew Carnegie's mansion, the industrialist, and the museum is housed in this building. My role is sort of unique, certainly for the Smithsonian. I think there are a few more chief experience officers in the museum sector now, but it really is about thinking about the experience in a holistic and integrated way. And by that, I mean really managing the physical side, so the building. So I manage operations and facilities, the human side, so the visitor experience staff and the gallery attendants, people that really have that first contact with the visitor, and the digital elements. So the various digital properties that the museum holds. And really it is about trying to bring together all aspects of the visitor experience across all touch points, and to think about how as a museum we present that experience in an integrated and holistic way, and what are the points at which we want to interact with the visitor along those touch points, excuse me, and what is that interaction? Is it wayfinding and signage to help people move around a building? Is it a friendly greeting or an inclusive and accessible greeting from somebody at the admissions desk? Or is it, you know, a website or an app or social media? But how do we as an organization present ourselves across all of those various channels, and how do we present that in a seamless way? So that's really the role of my role as Chief Experience Officer. And you can see that it's unusual because normally you have in museums different independent departments that are responsible for all of those areas of activity. So actually by bringing it together under one person within those departments, it then becomes a different kind of focus and a different kind of conversation. So very briefly, some of the things that we've been working on over the last couple of years, like everyone, we have been in a lockdown situation. We were closed for 14 months, which was actually a lot longer than other museums in New York, mainly because we are part of the Smithsonian and a federal entity. So we were not allowed to open. And in fact, the museum staff have still not gone back. It's still very much, you know, a skeleton team keeping the lights on in the museum. So we've been very focused on thinking about the digital experience, and also as we've started to reopen, to think about how we then transfer into more of a hybrid existence where, you know, we are continuing to build and grow and develop the digital experience, but also start to think about how that then marries with the physical experience. And that includes not just the programs and services we offer, but also about the staff, the kinds of skill sets we need, the pacing of the things that we do, what things perhaps are better suited in a digital world as to a physical world, but also how do the two align and how do they fit together. So this is one project that we did develop during the pandemic, during lockdown, and one that we'll keep going, which is called, it's a virtual exhibition platform. We had an exhibition on African-American designer Willie Smith that unfortunately closed literally, opened literally the day we closed. So we actually invested in developing an exhibition platform that's reusable. And so as we now move out of being closed and reopening, this is something that we will continue to think about developing and reusing for future exhibitions. As part of my role, I co-founded with a member of my team something called the Interaction Lab. This is an R&D visitor experience hub. This was really about how do we start thinking about museum transformation? How do we start thinking about creating new experiences across the museum in all of those areas that touch my portfolio. And this is a lab without walls. So this was really about inviting different kinds of partnerships, different kinds of relationships and skills into the museum to help us. It is an innovation, it's interaction, not innovation. And even though they are very similar words, the idea really was that this was a visitor experience hub, not a technology hub, and that it was not driven by technology or by technology for technology's sake, which is what we often see for innovation labs in museums. So this is very much about kind of aligning and supporting a holistic visitor experience. Some of the projects that we have done through the lab and Cooper Hewitt, one of which is called Activating Smithsonian Open Access. This was creative commissioning, which we did with a telecommunications company that sponsored us. And we gave out commissions to small technology teams, creative technology teams, to create interesting interactions with the Smithsonian's open access collection of 2 to 3 million objects. And that project went live in October of last year, and all of the prototypes are available on our website. And I'd be very happy to drop that link in for you to try them out. We also developed we also did a project with that was called Transforming Museum Experience, and out of it came a digital toolkit, tools and approaches for transforming museum experience. It's a co-created, co-authored toolkit made with 12 museum professionals from across the world engaged in progressive museum practice. We co-authored this toolkit. It's freely available to download. It is also now being translated into German by the Bandisches Landesmuseum in Germany, and is going to be distributed by the German Museums Association to every German museum. And Christian, obviously, if you're interested for Austrian museums, you've got a German version of that kit. And finally, another area I'm very interested in and have been promoting heavily at Cooper Hewitt and at the Smithsonian. It's a project I started in the United Kingdom called One by One, which is really about building digitally confident museums and digitally literate museums. And that's a research project with the University of Leicester. It's ongoing. And again, as part of museum transformation, how do we upskill? How do we develop, build digitally confident museums so that actually, when we have something like a pandemic or something else in the future, how do we manage that more effectively? And how, as museums, do we build and grow on what we've learned? So that's a whistle-stop tour of me and some of the projects that I have been involved in. And I'm very happy to hand back to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for these insights into your work, your projects, your strategies. Perhaps Jeffrey, would you like to continue?
I'm sure I'd be delighted to, and I'm also going to share my screen here and add to the whistle stop tour. This time our next stop is in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the US at MetaLab at Harvard, which is the lab that I run. I'm a cultural historian by training, but have for the past 25 years or so worked very actively in the sector of experimental museology. But it's within the framework of a broader set of interests and concerns that have to do with bringing forms of expert knowledge into realms of experience that go beyond the monograph and the scholarly journal, and trying to particularly innovate around these key pillars of the culture and knowledge economy that are libraries, archives, and museums. And MetaLab has a broad portfolio, if you like, of concerns, but our core commitment is to modeling the future rather than theorizing the future. We try to build stuff in collaboration with partners. And what particularly excites us in the museological sphere are opportunities for going beyond the modes of storytelling that we associate with conventional exhibition practice, and in a sense intertwining those traditional practices with new forms of micro and macro scale storytelling that leverage the power of databases to tell expanded kinds of stories. The second area, which is one I'm sure that will come back in the conversation, is the question of audience. Art museum audiences in particular have a fairly narrow demographic. And I think one of the opportunities that the digital brings with us is the opportunity to think about how we expand that audience, reach out to audiences who are not the most typical audiences of cultural institutions today. And that includes the topography, the audience understood in a kind of territorial sense that goes beyond the brick and mortar identity. I like to say that the website of every museum is its true facade onto the public square. And that public square is, of course, a global public square. The third area, and I'll say something about each of these in terms of a specific project, and this will be just a sort of flash presentation, is the restructuring of the temporality of the visit, which is to say there's now a before, during, and after that has a different kind of texture to it. And I think we have the opportunity to really invent new modes, new formats, new models of programming that leverage the power to connect and disconnect those different moments. The third point I want to make has to do with a broader curatorial proposition. And as museum professionals, most of us have been trained really to, in a sense, focus on the production values, on delivering a product that almost doesn't show its seams, that has no problems, inherent errors, or issues that are unresolved. But I think one of the great opportunities that the digital adds to the mix is the possibility of exhibiting questions and problems. And questions and problems are a fantastic way to engage audiences, a better way in many than product, that however well produced that product is. And the moral of this story for me is that the digital is not an either-or proposition with regard to the analog. It's an and with proposition, and our biggest challenges have to do with understanding where the value-added propositions lie, creating formats and forms and modes that are distinctive to each of those different channels in a multi-channeled world. So I'm just going to quickly show a couple of examples. One, it happens to be opening in a couple of months at the Harvard Art Museum in the Lightbox Gallery, which is an exhibition that MetaLab developed. It's built around collaborations between an AI and a human curator to try to experiment with ways in which we could engage in an expanded mode of curatorial practice on scales that are beyond the scales that a human curator typically operates on. And I'm just going to talk briefly about, this is just an introductory animation to one of the projects, which is one of the default programs that will be part of this show, which is a complete portrait of the Harvard Art Museum's collection, 250,000 objects. What you're seeing is just the animation, but if you actually experience this in the gallery, you have the opportunity as a visitor to literally navigate the collection as if you were in a planetarium where you had control over the projectors. And the experience of a collection at this kind of scale is a unique kind of experience. It's a different kind of experience than the experience we typically associate with collections. But when it's well designed and well executed, I think it adds a dimension to the experience that can be a really important one. Another project that's part of this suite is a project entitled The Flitting Atlas of the Human Gaze, which was an experiment that a couple of colleagues and I carried out using a series of AI services to basically tackle the analysis through machine vision of the directionality and orientation of the gaze of human subjects portrayed across 5 different collections: prints, photographs, sculptures, paintings, and coins. Now, this is a domain of experimental practice. It's artificial intelligence services are actually not very able or acute when it comes to identifying these kinds of fine details. So a lot of this required correction and collaboration between human expert viewers of these corpora, as well as this ability to scale through the use of AI systems. And what we basically developed was an experience where viewers could come and navigate an entire part of a collection of 12,000 objects, basically looking at the distribution of gazes across that collection. So I'm going to do something dangerous here, which is to do a live demo just to give you a sense of how this works. But so here you have it. Hopefully this will be fast enough. I'm taking you on a tour of the gazes, and you can see by moving my mouse around, I can actually follow the gazes of the subjects who are portrayed through tens of thousands of objects through the collection across media. But that view is only the aggregate view. There's also a view that allows you to see how certain media, certain genres map according to the distribution of gazes, the axis of vision, if you like. So this is just one example of the kind of experiments that strike me as some of the exciting opportunities that we have. And I'm going to go back to my, whoops, I was hoping to go back to my slides. Hold on. Let's see, I lost myself here. Okay. Let's see, just one second. Yeah, there we go. Okay. The third point I mentioned already, and this goes back to some earlier experiments, has to do with the sequence, the sort of the progress of a visit, the ability to connect off-site experiences to on-site experiences opens up a series of opportunities and channels, I think, to really think about the balance between the different objectives we have as curators, as institutions. And I did this early experiment. This is a sort of pre-Mark Zuckerberg metaverse experiment with a very unusual museum, which is a history museum, an experimental history museum that was built into 2 highway tunnels in the city of Trento in the Dolomites in the North Alto Adige region of Trentino region of Italy. And here the challenge was that this is a site that is not available to many of the target members of the target audience who are school kids, everything from elementary to middle to high schools. So the question was, how do we create this very rich, immersive experience in one of the tunnels and an instructional experience in the white tunnel, but how do we transmit it across a territory that where it's not a given that much of our audience will be able to be on site? And we did an experiment in the virtual world of Second Life at the time, where the entire apparatus for the immersive part of the exhibition is actually in Second Life. So the wall labels, so to speak, which would have interrupted the immersivity of the experience of the dark tunnel, is actually, the wall labels are located in the virtual world so that teachers can either before the visit allow their students to actually go through the sequence of archival, historical, documentary films, other sorts of documents that are part of this woven together immersive experience, and examine them before and after they undertake the physical visit. It was a mixed success, but I think these experiments are just signs of a future where we can think creatively about this before, during, and after. And last but not least, I wanted to mention the space where curatorial agents will be installed. It's the last space that visitors to the Harvard Museum traverse. So before they get there, they've already seen 1,803 objects installed, expertly installed in traditional galleries with all of the standard scholarly and scientific criteria that we expect of such spaces. So what does the Lightbox Gallery do? It opens up a horizon where we can work across the singularity of objects and see them in relation to one another, treat the collection as a network of interconnections. The visitor comes here, pulls an object out of the mosaic on the wall of monitors, and if they click on it, what they get is a representation of that object as a part of a database with a series of fields. And if you click on the fields, you get a projection, a data visualization projection on the back that shows you the positionality of that object with respect to all 1,803 other objects at the time. So maybe you're interested in provenance. Maybe you're interested in the part of the world that it's from, the century that it belongs to, but maybe you're interested in how many times it is accessed from offsite. All of these are stories that are interwoven through the database, but then become objects of experience for a visitor who's had the face-to-face experience of the object, but now sees that object in a new dimension through the addition of this layer of experience. So those are some of the things that I'm excited about in this space. And again, I think we're right at the beginning of that process. And I look forward to the discussion as we proceed here.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for this glimpse into your fascinating projects. Suze, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Suze Anderson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white middle-aged woman who is wearing a black top. I have a black and plaid, I'm not even sure what to call it. I have a fabric over that top. I have gold earrings shaped like rainbows and sort of a dark blonde hair. I'm currently located in Baltimore on the unceded land of the Piscataway, Lumbee, and Cherokee peoples. I'm going to speak really briefly about my work. I don't have a presentation or a slideshow. I came to museum technology about 12, 13 years ago, and I really got here by accident. I'd been working in the music industry at the time, and I happened across some work that was being done at the Powerhouse Museum in Australia, looking at museums and their work with technology. And I was very interested in how museums, these institutions that ostensibly dealt in the physical, would adapt to thinking about the digital. And that's been my work ever since. In 2014, I moved to Baltimore to work at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where I became I was digital content manager, then director of audience experience. So a very softened down version of what Carolyn does in terms of, I was trying to think of the online and the on-site, but not from the executive level that she was thinking about. And then in 2016, I moved to the George Washington University, where I am now, to teach classes around museums and technology. In recent years, however, I've started adding to that a course on museum ethics and values, and it's actually the interaction of technology and ethics that's where my work is lying at the moment, which has been an incredibly interesting place to start thinking. I'm starting to focus. Sorry, by the way, I apologize for the dings. For some reason, everyone has just started contacting me for something completely unrelated to this. I'm really interested in museum ethics and values as they relate to digital technology, thinking about the ethics of care, about the choices that we ask visitors, source communities, even our staff to make when they interact with technology in a museum context. That means thinking about the risks we ask people to take, whether it's risks with their data and thinking about data privacy, whether it's thinking about digitization of collections and the way digitization of collections can help reinforce or can challenge existing systems, existing stories around and existing histories. So, I'm very interested in how museums interact with other platforms. So, for instance, social media platforms, which have their own normative values and normative expectations that might be at odds with what museums themselves are thinking about. So thinking about what it means for these ostensibly institutions of knowledge to exist in an environment where surveillance capitalism is such a key to the digital air in which we're breathing. So they're the sorts of things that I'm thinking about, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with Christian and with Carolyn and Jeffrey, because I think they're all thinking about a lot of these things as well, but they're coming at them from quite interesting, both practical and theoretical standpoints as well, that I think would be really helpful. So Christian, I'll bounce back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Suze. I actually stumbled today over a highly successful podcast that you didn't mention, Museopunks, that you are actually running for quite a long time. And there was episode 41 that interested me, where the title is Digitization is not neutral. And I think that speaks to the point that you just made. I did not listen to it yet, but is so political, I guess, in digitization.
Yes, and that particular episode gets to some really important issues that, in fact, were raised in a European context initially. They were raised in response to the Savoy report, thinking about repatriation, and that acts of digitization so often privilege Western, the global North institutions, even down to copyright and intellectual property, which are these concepts that particularly come from a Western perspective. And so for source communities from around the world, they might not actually, if you've got objects that are created in a communal sense, or that are really communal objects rather than relating to an individual owner, for instance, these very much might be not supported by museums' current digitization practices, especially with the idea of open access. For so long in this sector, there was a push towards open access, and this idea that once we digitize collections, that we should make them available quite broadly. It enables people to use the collections in ways we've never imagined. It helps us recomplexify our collections by connecting them back into flows of culture. But that's not a neutral act, because there are still objects advantaged by that. There are still ways that that might not be appropriate for different kinds of objects. That might be, for instance, objects that are only meant to be viewed by members of a particular source community. So thinking about the ways, the choices that museums make, and how blanket choices such as open access, they're still advantaging certain parts of the collection and certain creators. Yeah,
quite clearly the choices we make there have a a larger impact. We need to bear in mind that what connects all three of you, I think, or I kind of hear, is this focus also on experience. Suze, you finished your book, The Digital Future of Museums, with a well-known quote that museums transition from being about something to being for somebody. And I was not, I heard that a couple of times, and it seems still so true that we have to think more about our audiences, our communities, and the social aspects of what we are doing. But I was not aware that this is already 20 years old, this quote. So what happened in between, I was wondering. But what we see, and especially in America, because I don't know anybody in Europe, which doesn't mean that I know everything, that you have more and more these experience offices like Caroline. There is no digital anymore in the job, this title at least. And I'm stunned about this development and was wondering whether we will see that more and more. And is there a problem, or could there be a problem of over-caring about the visitor? Caroline?
Well, I'm a huge advocate for moving away, not from digital expertise or having a head of digital or whatever the title is, but I think there are real advantages to having a position like mine that actually is breaking down the traditional silos. It made a lot of sense to have, a head of digital when digital first came into museums, because it was a new area of activity. It was also what I would call a cottage industry in the museum. My first desk was in the corner of someone else's office, and no one cared what I was doing or understood what I was doing. And we're obviously in a completely different place now, and that transformation has happened incredibly rapidly, catalyzed even more so by what's happened over the last 2 years. So for me, now starting to think, well, what's next, in terms of museum technologists and what are the career pathways? It's when you're a curator in a museum, you have a very, very clear line of promotion. It is less clear when you're in museum technology. And what we've seen as well over the last 2 years is a massive talent drain, because there isn't really a lot of places for people to go in museum technology. They get to a certain level and then they leave because they have very valuable skills, which they can generally get paid a lot more for than they can in the museum world. So for me, this is really about evolving our roles, and also I think it reflects the importance of the activity that we do now for museum missions and the criticality of what we're doing. Again, no more so than we've seen over the last 2 years. And so actually having somebody who is thinking about the experience at large, but then having a head of digital under them, or having a head of marketing, or whatever, however your museum is organized, feels to me like a really great step in the right direction for breaking down these silos, which are completely artificial and make no sense to a visitor, and are really reflective, of a museum organization, not actually of a visitor experience. So I would really love to see more of these roles in Europe, and experimentation around what the makeup of those departments are. I mean, I'm actually moving to a new role next month in a different museum, and I have a very different makeup of departments. Some are the same and some different, but it's not a one size fits all. But I do think it is really about a philosophy and an ethos and a mindset about, how do we start to think in a more integrated way in that reflects more of what the visitor experience is.
Isn't this a huge challenge to institutions in terms of change management? Because for a while, I think there was this idea that, yeah, in which department do we put the digital? And somebody said it's not answerable. You just put it, it's like the sofa, you put it there where it fits. But in the end, if you are, in the end, you have to completely transform an institution. And I wonder how this happened at your place, because I never saw anybody who is managing the digital and information technology, visitor services and facilities. I mean, this is kind of unique, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, the facilities bit was really just, I mean, that was not part of my plan. That just sort of happened. But actually, it made a lot of sense to me, because now, you know, my understanding of the building and the issues with the building, particularly for access, and particularly for wayfinding, but also understanding, you know, that one of the most important jobs in a museum is making sure that your restrooms, your bathrooms are clean and well managed, because almost every visitor, that is the first place they go to when they come into your museum. And I, you know, I sort of knew that, but didn't really understand what that meant. But by actually managing that team and thinking about the whole of the onboarding experience at the museum, it suddenly made a whole lot of sense. And also, you know, the facilities team, the building service workers, as they call it at the Smithsonian, you know, are critical. They are a critical frontline support, and, you know, no more so than the people that, you know, they were the ones going into the museum every day when we were in lockdown and literally keeping the lights on, and kind of just understanding the ecosystem within the museum and how it works, I think is really, really important. And I think you're right. It is a massive change, Christian, and it has to happen at the top. It has to happen, you know, in an organization where the director on down understands why this is important and supports that change. And that is also why, you know, in my presentation, I highlighted the building digitally confident museums, because skill set and building more staff that feel more confident about using digital tools is also going to help and benefit this kind of approach. And that, again, starts at the top with your director and your leadership team. So yes, it is difficult, and yes, it is new, and yes, it could be overwhelming, but I think that's a better alternative than staying where we are frankly, in organizations that old-fashioned and not working.
Christian, can I just add on to that quickly?
Sure.
So I teach a class called Critical Visitor Experience. It's a really fun class. It's a very small class. And we just go to a different museum every week and we look at how the visitor experience works. We try and break down the visitor experience in different institutions and build almost a vocabulary of visitation. And we look at, like, what are the bathrooms like? I make my students go into the bathrooms and see not only are they clean, but what sort of facilities are there for parents and caregivers. What, you know, we actually go through that, and that's part of the class. And one of the things that we bump up against, and that I notice, and that I think Carolyn's role has been so important, is if different teams within an institution own all of those different pieces, it's very hard to get a consistent and holistic experience. And so having all of those parts, having someone who has ownership over them and how they come together, becomes then really helpful in creating a much stronger experience right across the institution. And having someone with a digital background is so helpful, particularly as we look at things like the increase in timed ticketing, say, especially in response to COVID, but even predating that. Thinking about then how someone will have interacted with the institution before they arrived, using the website, using, doing things online, and then how they get there. That consistency of experience that a visitor interacts with makes such a big difference to how they understand, how they're able to then relax and enjoy the exhibitions, or relax and enjoy the other parts of the museum, because the things that would actually get in the way of, not being able to get into the institution, not being able to use a bathroom, not being able to use the wayfinding, they're the things that actually often will shape a negative or positive experience in the institution in a completely different way that distracts from the educational mission of the institution if it's not done well. Mm-hmm. So although Carolyn's position might be still an unusual one, I think it's actually one of the really important innovations in recent years, because that's that ownership, that accountability for how these things work together is a really interesting and important move forward. And the fact that it's got digital as part of it, but not the whole, is, I think, actually also really essential to how digital fits within institutional spaces.
Yeah, that basically speaks also to the main thesis of our conference, that it's about interweaving the digital and the analog in the future, and not just being completely enthusiastic about digital, which is the future, and the analog was the past, and all of that. But the question was also, and I think Jeffrey touched on it, does it all need to come together in the physical space, the digital and the analog? Isn't there also a before, during, and after? And Jeffrey was also wondering what you think a genuine digital experience or a meaningful digital experience could actually be. I think we still don't have a lot of experience about that, and there is still a lot to experiment and to explore.
Yeah, I mean, just to link up to some of the earlier threads in the discussion, I mean, I think we're still struggling with embracing the true hybridity of our institutions. The actual hybridity is not reflected in organizational structures and the distribution of responsibilities, the roles. But just to add one other dimension to this, I think the database systems that museums maintain and are essential to their operations are largely developed by, based on kind of inventory type practices. They weren't really designed to be a kind of extended expression of the collection. So we have to have people who understand curatorial issues, art historical issues, social issues at the table when those systems are designed, in order to create experiences that cover the real set of possible opportunities that we have. So it really runs through the whole system, from the door to the bathrooms, to the galleries, to the storage systems, to the very way in which we imagine the organizations. I think on the question of meaningful digital experiences, I think we have lots of models in contemporary society. They are largely outside the doors of the museum as an institution. And I think the challenge is to understand how they can dialogue with and intersect those practices. You touched on this, Christian, just briefly in the way you framed the question around the powers and limitations of experience as a focus, or paying attention to our audiences. Museums have a responsibility to their audiences. Certainly in the first instance, they also have responsibilities to maintain collections. They have a longer kind of cultural memory that they're committed to constructing and being the shepherds of, the guardians of. All of those responsibilities bring together the analog and the digital and merge them together. And I think one of the challenges we face in answering your question about what's a meaningful digital experience is that we certainly can't assume that it has the same duration or the same mode of engagement than a conventional gallery experience. But our cultural institutions have tended to be rather hesitant when it comes to experiences that are fast, for example, just to give an example, or experiences that are not, don't involve a depth dimension rather than some other kind of sense. We see the battle, for example, over immersivity, and it's whether that's I'm very skeptical myself of a lot of what I see out there, like I suspect a lot of you, but on the other hand, there's something there that maybe is worth studying as we explore how we can balance these different responsibilities that that a museum has as a cultural, historical, and social institution. So we're in the early days in answering that question. And I think what we need are models of success, model experiments. We need to take some risks, and we need to, especially to be willing to rethink some of our core concepts and operations and strategies.
Since you mentioned this hype, actually, and we heard it in the conference also at certain points, this hype of immersive environments. We have currently the Van Gogh Alive in Vienna, and it has the subtitle, The Experience. And that's why I'm also so suspicious when museums are talking so much about the experience. What experience are we talking about? And then again, to your point, Jeffrey, that obviously museums keep databases. Initially, there were some type of inventorying the collection, and so are the systems that we are using, and it was never about publishing. But how do we get closer to what this Van Gogh Alive experience would be, so that it doesn't look like a database on the website? Is a big challenge, or do we even need to go there? Because, you know, on the one hand, Mark Zuckerberg with his metaverse explained clearly the transition from like text to image, to moving image, to immersive environments, to the metaverse. Do we have to distinguish ourselves and the work that we are doing, or shall we fully endorse that?
Does anybody want to tackle that one? I mean, I'd be happy to jump in if I have a lot of thoughts about that. Suze, did you want to jump in? I think for me, what's interesting about the metaverse is first of all, it sounds so 1990s to me. It's not even funny. I mean, those of us who have been interested in 3D, you know, 3D web, you know, can take you through the rise and fall of many other moments in this conversation. And which isn't to say that I'm skeptical about the value of immersivity, but immersivity is not some kind of metaphysical thing out there. This is really a conversation about a medium, an emergent medium that requires its own storytelling modes, its own you know, it has limits and powers like every medium, and how do we insert it into the other obligations, the other commitments that we have, I think is the larger question, not so much whether either or, you know, do we embrace or don't we embrace? So in the experiment that I just quickly sketched in the Trento tunnels, we tried to create an immersive experience of historical archives of World War I. But we didn't want to interrupt that immersion by putting the didactic apparatus on top of that you would expect of a gallery experience. So the question was then, how do we recover that didactic layer, which is essential to the fruition of those documentary, historical, archivistic resources? And I think you can have it both ways, but you have to have it both ways through a design solution that layers them together meaningfully and creates the possibility for both that kind of intense sense of immersion and something that leads you beyond that. Because the problem, I don't know if you visited the Van Gogh.
No, not yet. But
Vienna, I don't necessarily recommend it, but it's good for about 5 minutes. That would be my argument. It's actually really good for about 5 minutes. I went to the Klimt one in Paris. After 5 minutes, it feels tiresome because it doesn't lead anywhere beyond. And I think that's maybe a hint of where some of the powers as well as the limitations are that could be an expressive feature of how we expose audiences, create experiences for audiences of the kinds of materials that we're the custodians of.
And is it just the multimedia aspect that is disturbing? Because we had also the discussion about putting sonic enhancements into online exhibitions or online collections, and it completely changes, I think, the perception as soon as you put sound into such a thing.
I have a slightly different take on the experience. I went to the Van Gogh experience in New York. I didn't really want to go, but I felt like I professionally should go and experience it and see it. And actually, it was sort of fascinating because, you know, it's on a pier in New York City. It's, you know, you get there, it's $45 to park your car. It's $55 to go in, you know, and I was standing in the line in the queue to get in with a colleague of mine, and in front of us were three people who were completely dressed in sunflower merchandise, cap, t-shirt, tote bag, everything you could possibly imagine. And I said to them, you know, oh, have you been before? You know, and they said, no, we ordered all of this online in order to be able to wear it to come to this thing. And I was just sort of fascinated, but it was like, you know, going to a sporting event, you know, or going to a rock concert, or, you know, it was about something else, not about going to a museum like thing. And went in, it was, you know, massive shop was the first thing that you saw. You know, the interpretation was 3 panels on a wall away from anything, any of the immersion, that was covered 6 years of Van Gogh's life. And then that was it. And then you went in and you basically, you know, was in a multimedia show. And there were people lying on the floor, there were people sitting around. We ended up like just talking, you know, while this was sort of going on in the background. Did I learn anything? No. Did I have an experience? Yes, I did. And then, you know, and I watched people around, and they were doing lots of selfies, and they were having conversations, and they were, you know, you could get up, you could really see in kind of micro detail, you know, some aspects of the artwork that you wouldn't perhaps be able to see in a painting. I went to the restrooms because I've already talked about how important they are. And, you know, there were some women in the restroom discussing, you know, what a great time they've had. And they've like ticked off the art, like they've done art in museums in New York, or they've done art in New York, their culture, you know, and now they were going off to do something else. And I guess what I came away with was this is real. This is happening all over the world. People are willing to pay $55. People are enjoying it. And it has to, for me, be an and situation. They exist, but what do we as museums, how do we complement that? How do we add to that? How do we differentiate ourselves from it? And how do we, but most important, you know, and I suffered from it myself, because I was like, no, I don't want to go. No, I don't want to go. This isn't art. This isn't real. This isn't something I want to experience. Then, but actually, you know, it has changed my mind and my attitude. And now I'm very, very interested in what I can learn from that and take into, you know, thinking about transforming a museum experience, and what can we offer that's not 3 panels about 6 years of an artist's life. You know, how can we add value? How can we build out through the objects that we have and through the stories that we can tell, a different kind of experience that's as exciting and inviting to visitors as, you know, the one that people were willing to spend $55 to go to in New York. And I will say that the very first thing that I did when museums opened up in New York was I went to the Museum of Modern Art, and I stood in front of the Starry Night on my own in the gallery for 20 minutes. And it was an incredible experience for me, you know, coming out of, you know, quite a severe lockdown in New York City. And that's where I chose to go, and that's what I went to look at. And to be on my own in the Museum of Modern Art, who, for any of you that have been, it's a very, very busy museum. And to stand in front of that piece of art was incredibly moving, and nothing will ever take away from that experience for me and that meaning, the meaning of that for me. But we have to, I think I feel very, very strongly that we are now living in an and, and we have, as museums, need to think about that again from the visitor perspective.
Yeah, I guess we should open up to the floor or to the audience, to the question of the audience, and there's something connected to that, but I think you already have answered it. Would people be disappointed when they see an original Van Gogh in the museum since it's not animated? And I guess you have answered that, right? Then there's another one.
Christian, can I add something very quickly that I think
sure.
that?
I did leave you out on this
very,
one.
very quickly. I think that oftentimes one of the best things, this goes to what Jeffrey was talking about and Carolyn, that new digital contexts can help us figure out and articulate what was unique and special about the thing that was before it, that preceded it. So the Van Gogh experience helps us understand and think about, well, then what is so special and so unique about standing by self and being in the presence of a Van Gogh in person, that the metaverse and thinking about, well, how do we tell stories that are unique to this context also helps us then say, well, then what is so special about being in the museum physically, and what becomes, how do we then push that further? And so if anything, it's the digital that helps us articulate the thing that's special about the not digital, and vice versa. They become tools for better work because they help us understand what is unique to each environment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's also what I think we saw it actually quite clearly during the lockdown, when we just had access to digital content, that the craving for the original and a different kind of experience in a space with other people was really something that became important. There's another question. How can we connect the content of a museum that a museum puts out on the internet, the multimedia content, AR, VR, a museum presents inside the exhibition, and the actual artworks? At most museums, I feel like they exist next to each other and not together. I don't know whether somebody has this experience, had this experience too. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the presumption that informs the question. I mean, and I think this comes back to some of the larger points that Susan and Carolyn were making earlier, which is, as long as we treat the digital as something that has come later, been added in, and therefore is somehow external to, all of the, sort of pre-digital features of the museum as an institution, we tend to treat the, web extensions of that institution as somehow a parallel universe that doesn't directly intersect with what we do on site in the brick and mortar environment. And whoa, what just happened? Whoops, sorry, I lost the connection for a second. And I think where the opportunity, the pandemic has been a great accelerator of, I think Sue's answer to the last discussion was great for me, because that's exactly the point as I see it. The digital and some of the solutions that cultural institutions have had to embrace during the shutdown have prompted us to start to think of what are the things that we could do on these channels that we're not doing, that are distinctive, not that just are an impoverished or a replica of what we might offer on site. And I think the whole question of what is an online gallery experience, for example, what should it be? What should be? How do we represent objects? Is a photograph really a still photograph an adequate way to begin a conversation between a potential visitor and part of our collection. Maybe we can do better than that. There are a lot of other ways to tell stories, to describe, but they have to be specific to the capabilities of those channels. And so I think we have the opportunity now, as we return to a new normal, to invent some of those modes and experiment with those modes. Suze mentioned earlier in the discussion the whole question of repatriation, the conversations around certain kinds of collections. The digital dimension is a powerful place to think about some of these questions. Like, what does it mean to repatriate an object? Can we, a combination of digital repatriation and other forms of sharing become integral to the way we imagine the custodianship, the kind of historical role of institutions of culture for preserving forms, but also disseminating them? And I think the answer is yes, but we have to create these new forms and formats and integrate them into the, standard operating procedures for museums.
Was then COVID a catalyst for that we become more critical of what we want to develop further and what we can leave behind? Carolyn?
I agree with a lot of what Jeffrey just said, and I mean, it will sound a little bit strange for somebody who's come from a digital background, but I really haven't seen a lot of great execution of AR and VR in gallery spaces. And I think really thinking about how we use digital in the physical space, how it can really truly augment what people are seeing or add value or deepen, not just in terms of what we make, but how it's delivered to visitors, where it is situationally in museums, whether people can sit down and actually, take time to have a, really look deeper if that's the experience you want them to have, or, and so I think there's a lot of things that we need to be thinking about. And I think for me, the jury is still out on really, and it's something I continue to grapple with and really don't have a satisfactory answer to. My answer basically to new technology was to create, to think about creating a lab and actually having an R&D space, because I think the other thing that we attach to that is how these things get funded. And so often, certainly in America, we're chasing money and often, building things that actually are not in the best interest of the museum or in the best interest of the visitor, but they are, something that has been funded, or you're given money and you're supposed to know what it is that you're going to be building before you've even started building it. And you're like committed to something that actually ultimately is very disappointing. And so having a space where we could work more quickly, where we could do it on lesser budgets. But the difference, as I said, was integrating it into the museum practice, not being a lab at the side where people are doing interesting things, but it's not really impacting the museum in any significant way. And so I think, again, changing our practice and changing the way that we approach new technology in museums. We're not technology companies. So how do we adopt new technologies? How do we experiment with new technologies? How do we create a culture where it's where that work is valued and where we learn? And it may be that we don't end up progressing with the thing that we're prototyping, but we've learned an awful lot from it and we're going to move on. And I think creating that space within museums to be able to do that kind of work, to do that kind of creative thinking. And also, one of the things that we did at Cooper Hewitt was we actually had a creative commissioning program, so that we were actually giving out small sums of prototype money to creative technologists who would never normally be able to answer a brief for a museum, because the amount of time and effort it would take them is not worth it, or the fact that they'd be competing with 10 other companies, you know, for a small team is not worth it. They can't afford to work that way. So actually that Activating Smithsonian Open Access project brought 7 new creative teams into the museum that just we would never have worked with before, and they were incredible. So, you know, actually thinking creatively about how we as an institution can engage with creative industries and different kinds of creative teams is, you know, is I think another important aspect of the work that we need to do. So less fixation on the technology for technology's sake, and more about what are we doing, why are we doing it, who are we doing it for, and how can we do it in a way that is actually financially and operationally sustainable.
It's a huge thing, because what often happens in museums is that you kind of approach those tech companies because in-house you would never have an R&D department or experimentation, time for experimentation and figuring things out. I think a lot of museums are just not in a position to do that, and that's a little bit, I guess, a problem.
Well,
so,
just
yeah?
to say, Christian, I have a tiny team at Cooper Hewitt.
Okay, good. So it's possible.
You know, that work, that is about working in partnership, and that is about, you know, developing briefs together. That's about, you know, having, you know, the open access project, Activating Smithsonian Open Access, was a 10-week project, a 10-week development cycle. And at the end of it, you know, there were 7 working prototypes, and, you know, some of those may get scaled up into products. The sponsor has taken 2 of those prototypes forward and is investing more in them. One of the prototypes, you know, we've taken to the Smithsonian Enterprise, the commercial arm of the Smithsonian, to look at productizing. So all sorts of outputs from that were unexpected, but they were not about my team building them. Okay, I see.
Susan, do you think that museums became more democratic places also because of digital possibilities?
Ooh,
or is this a too big question? Perhaps we should not even tackle it so late in this debate.
Yeah, I think I'll say something quickly about it. I think that digital technologies, and particularly early social media, helped support some movements that were already happening. You know, brought in the quote early on, this idea of museums going about, you know, from being, you know, about something to being for somebody. I think that digital technologies, social media platforms that enabled more people to have a more public voice and to participate did have an early and important effect on helping democratize discussion, decision-making. It started to raise questions about hierarchies within museums and who participates and how they can participate. Now, they're really important questions, and I think they're questions we're still grappling with, because I'm not sure that museums have ultimately become more democratic. I'm not sure that social media has ultimately shown that it is the right vehicle for things to become more democratic, because we've seen that platforms have increasingly controlled information. In some ways, we've sort of seen a shutting down where there was an opening up. But there were important questions raised from sort of the movements that were happening in technology that are not yet answered. And I think that those questions have made a really big impact. I think a lot of the museums that are grappling with questions around repatriation, around racial reckoning, and thinking about Black Lives Matter, for instance, I think a lot of those questions have come because more people have had a voice in the conversation that have been incredibly valuable. So I'm not sure that I can say that technology has helped make museums more democratic, but I think it started to push some of the conversations into some really interesting and important ways that does help it's helping us think about how we serve people. So when we think about being for someone, it's helping us be better at thinking about, well, who is that someone and how are we going to be better for them? I made a comment in the chat before that one of the biggest paradoxes museums face is that when we think about preserving things for the future and preparing for the future and thinking about some unknown future, often makes a really big tension when we think about how we serve people today, because often the needs of an unknown future seem quite separate from the demands of today. It's like preparing for climate crisis, for instance. The policies you have to enact now for a thing with an unknown future can often be at odds with someone saying, well, hold on, what about my job? But having the conversation is part of the way that we do start to make really interesting and important choices that make museums more equitable, more fair, more inclusive.
Thank you for this addressing this really difficult question. I think we are more or less running out of time, but nevertheless, perhaps a quick closing statement from each of us. Perhaps there is something that you still want to comment on, but very briefly, please. Jeffrey, do you have something that you still want to?
Well, just one point to make, which is maybe related to the question of democratization. And I share Suze's response. I don't think we can say with any certitude that a process of democratization has been accelerated by the pandemic. I do think that there is a process of re-territorialization that the pandemic has reinforced, because one of the transformative aspects of the importance of that digital facade that is on every 21st century cultural institution is that those institutions are now speaking to an audience that is far beyond their local territory. And that's, of course, an opportunity. And by the way, that includes also the potential for communities of researchers to be able to work with museum databases and to produce new knowledge forms and to democratize the knowledge that circulates around in the field of culture and history and art. But that's not going to happen without infrastructure. And the vast majority of institutions throughout the world do not have full publicly accessible databases that researchers can work with, not to mention members of the ordinary public work with. We have a long, long way to go before the human record is digitized. I don't know what the current estimates are of the percentages of the cultural heritage that are locked up in storage, but it surely exceeds 50%, and it's probably closer to 90%. So I think on the subject of democratization, without major investments to create that infrastructure, democratization, not to mention the potential for innovation, will be very severely curbed.
Carolyn, a very brief final thought.
My very brief final thought is that I think there are going to be many, many opportunities coming out of this crisis. And I am actually excited about the future.
Great, optimism. That's what we need. Suze, you have the final word.
I'm closing on optimism too. That one of the lovely things about crisis is, strangely to put it lovely, but crisis breaks things, and when we start to put things back together, it's a chance to say, well, is this actually working and is this not working? And that's really important because it gives us a chance to do things differently. And I think so much of what Carolyn, for instance, has spoken about is different models and different ways forward. And it's the people who are here, it's having the people in this discussion who are tuning in for this conference, that they can help make some of that come to fruition, and that it also is a chance that we can think responsibly, think ethically, think about how we move forward in ways that take care of our staff and take care of our communities in very different ways.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Thanks to my panelists for this really nice and insightful discussion. I guess we could go on, but we have to conclude. It's late already in Europe, perhaps not so much for you on the East Coast. I would finally also like to thank all participants and speakers and all of you across the world to stay with us those days. We tried to kind of compress the program into snackable pieces, and I hope you enjoyed it the last couple of days. Let me also thank the whole team that was working on this conference, and there would be, again, many names to mention, but I just want to name the ones that are behind the scenes right now. It's Anne-Marie Kropova, who was, I guess, in touch with many of you to organize this conference. Many thanks. It really went wonderfully. I think there was not a major issue. And then also Kevin Breiteneder and Katharina Walleritz, who were just fantastic. Thank you all. And we will also try to put this conference online as much as we can. It obviously depends on the speakers, but we did that for the last 3 conferences, and we will do that again. So thanks, and have a good day or evening or wherever you are. Bye-bye.